very great pleasure to see you all here tonight on this chilly Sydney night, and to see you here in such numbers. A great compliment to all of you, and in particular to our speaker, Professor John Keane, whose most recent book, China's Galaxy Empire, is to be launched in just a few days' time. So we're the sort of advance army for hearing about what John has to say to us. You'll have read the blurb for our address tonight, so I'm not going to repeat all of that. But it is a fascinating study of the way China has turned into such an extraordinary power. I'm told that one of our senior counsellors, Jocelyn Che, who's a very long-standing China expert, has said words to the effect that with the publication of this book, all previous histories of China's rise are obsolete. On that note, it's a great pleasure to hand over to Professor John Keane.
Thank you very much, Ian. I'd also like to thank Jenny for her tireless and very professional work. I'm very glad to be back here at AIIA. You will know that book sales continue to rise globally. My own impression is that book reading is in decline. And so I thought I would help you out by, in about 30 minutes, giving you a very thumbnail sketch of the ideas that run through this China's Galaxy Empire book. And I want to do so, ladies and gentlemen, friends, family, colleagues, by kangaroo hopping through 10 points, beginning with a 19th century Chinese proverb, which runs that when the winds of change blow, some people build walls and others build windmills. Look at the evidence that's developing in this year and has been for the last 20 or more years. China is the place where the 4 biggest banks in the world are located. China is in the process of outflanking bodies like the IMF and the World Bank by becoming the largest creditor in the world, building new institutions like the AIIB, which the Americans tried to boycott, but which we are now members of. China is spearheading a global rebellion against the US dollar. De-dollarization is a fact, and it's gaining in strength. China is the largest trading country. It's the EU's main trading partner in goods. There is an outflanking of the United States going on in Latin America, the book describes, where countries like Chile and Peru and Uruguay and Colombia are now principally trading with China, and where Chinese investment is much more important than American investment. There is, of course, the much discussed Belt and Road Initiative, for which Xi Jinping will be undoubtedly remembered and his legacy judged. In terms of investment, it's a kind of omnibus program. In terms of investment, it's 7 times larger than what the Americans invested in Western Europe after 1945. China is, as you know, home to very large telecommunications state-of-the-art companies, Alibaba, China Telecom, and so on. Despite American efforts to block Chinese investment in China, companies like Airbus and Tesla, the German chemicals giant BASF and so on, continue to invest in that country. It's not a closed socialist economy, it's a form of state capitalist economy I describe in the book. In matters of everyday life, there are also remarkable things going on. Life expectancy has risen from around 51 in China in 1962 to 77.1. Life expectancy in China is now higher than in the United States, where life expectancy, healthy life expectancy, is in decline. There is, as you know, a very large middle class, maybe 400 million people, for whom empire, I'm going to suggest, has become a way of life. They're loyal to the system. They're guided by dreams of the 3 Zs, of feng ce, che ce, and pian ce, house, car, and money. They keep their heads down, they're very good at it, and they like to share jokes such as follow the party but listen to your wife. This is a middle class that shows no signs of wanting to have free and fair elections. It's a middle class that has grown by tremendous investment in education, higher education, a tenfold increase during the past 2 decades. China produces more STEM graduates, science, technology, and so on, than India, the United States, Japan, Germany, France, Italy, the UK, and Canada combined. And when it comes to the military, you will know that the People's Liberation Army is now the world's largest standing army, 2 million troops, a nuclear arsenal, a very large number of submarines, etc., etc. So this is the first point, that something very big is going on. Second point is that I want to just briefly summarize what the big idea of this book is. There is, I think, as you will be aware, rising recognition that there is something big going on. Boris Johnson, of course known for his exaggerations, refers to China, the rise of China, as a gigantic fact in our lives. Ursula von der Leyen says that China will define this century. And if you read the speeches of Joe Biden, you will find that he says things like, the United States has to get smart because actually China is on the rise and it's going to outflank us, and unless we retool, we are going to be second fiddle in the world. These kinds of pictures of the rise of China is what this book is about. The argument is that what we're witnessing is the emergence of an empire of a kind that the world has never seen before. And I call it a galaxy empire. I'll try to explain why I use that unconventional phrase. It's the first empire to be born of the digital communications era. It's only 40 years old. It's having gravitational push-pull effects globally on every continent, including Antarctica. It's building its own version of a rules-based order. For example, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is one of the institutions that is very central to the emergence of this new empire. It's not a big power, it's not a sovereign state, it's not a monolithic autocracy, I try to say in this book. It defies previous definitions of land, sea, and air empires. It's something new, it combines those, and it has, of course, a strong interest in the wider galaxy. I'll say more about that in a moment. What this book is against is simple-minded thinking about China. It's a plea for looking at the protean, multiplex, kaleidoscopic qualities of this emergent China. And in this sense, the book is an enemy of big China, bad China politics. I'll explain why in a moment, but this is the gist of the book. A new empire is on the rise. I call it a galaxy empire, and we need to pay attention to it. We need to understand the nuances and the complexities, its strengths and its weaknesses. Third point, what's an empire, you will ask? Put very simply, an empire, tricky word, is a very large polity whose economic, governing, diplomatic, and cultural power spills out way beyond its borders. Empires, in this sense, are much more than what IR people call a hegemonic power. China is an empire in the sense that it not only negotiates the boundaries, so to say, of the states where it's investing or with which it's negotiating, actually its power enters into the affairs of those states. And an empire, put abstractly, is also, of course, not just an economic political governing arrangement, a long-distance rule. It's also a polity which tries to get under the skin of its subjects. That is to say, it tries to reshape the everyday habits of its subjects. That's a point that was made long ago by Frantz Fanon, and much more recently by the Zimbabwean writer Tsitsi Dangarembga, who writes about the psychology, a Zimbabwean writer, who writes about the psychology of colonization and empire. Fourth point, one striking thing when you look into what is being said in Beijing by diplomats all the way through to the Politburo to Xi Jinping, is that the little word empire, 帝国, is not used. I myself have tried to use it, for example, in interviews with Xinhua, and the excerpts are always cut, and playing the role of apparent naive fool, I ask why, and they say it's a bad word. It's a bad word because it's what was done to us. And the narrative is that China is today respectful of the sovereignty of all states, that China is a sovereign state, it's not an empire. We respect the independence of all other states. Well, this denial of empire, this attachment by Chinese diplomats, party officials, and so on, to the language of sovereignty, of state sovereignty, is very useful. For instance, it allows the Chinese not to get involved in certain conflicts directly, such as the Russia-Ukraine war. It allows investments to be done in a kind of non-ethical way. You can deal with any state, and so on. It's also should be obvious that this denial of empire is what rising empires typically do. You may know that still in the United States, you can't use the word empire. There is the famous interview that Al Jazeera did with Donald Rumsfeld shortly after the American invasion of Iraq, where, and I'm quoting, he said, Rumsfeld, "We don't seek empires, we're not imperialistic. We've never been. I can't imagine why you'd even ask the question." This kind of denial of empire is, as it were, replicated on the lips of Chinese diplomats. Now, if you only have a cursory grasp of Chinese history, you'll know, for instance, that the Qing Empire established the boundaries, more or less, of what today China is, including the takeover of Tibet and Xinjiang. You will also know that there are television series celebrating empire. So it's very odd that this word is not used. And what I want to say, this is the fourth point, that not only is something big going on in world affairs, but what we're witnessing is the birth of a galaxy empire. Fifth point, why the words, why the phrase galaxy empire? Well, there is a handful of reasons that the book tables to try to justify this unusual phrase, beginning with the obvious point that the aim of this book is to get you thinking by using a phrase that's unfamiliar, which criticizes the continuing grip of sovereignty, state sovereignty thinking, and which tries to get you to see that actually a new language is needed. A new perspective is needed, an unorthodox perspective is needed in order to make sense of the great complexity of this so-called rise of China. The phrase galaxy empire is, of course, it owes a lot to astrophysics and astronomy. You'll know that they tell us, the astronomers, that there are about 100 billion galaxies so far, and all of them are hugely complex. And the point of calling this a galaxy empire is to emphasize the very great complexity of this emergent Chinese empire. And in the book, I try to say that previous usages of the word empire, such as the work by Ross Terrell, one of our scholars locally, is much too simple. He pictured this China as a big China driven by Marxism, Leninism, run by a party that's autocratic. Actually, this is much too simple, and the book tries to deal with that rather critically. This phrase, the galaxy empire, is of course, it puts its finger on the great interest in outer space. You will know that GPS, satellite navigation system, is basically being replaced by Beidou, the Big Dipper. You will know that the first landing on the dark side of the moon has happened. You will know that there's a rover, Zhurong, which is on planet Mars. I think it's asleep at the moment. It doesn't seem to be waking up. You will also know that sophisticated cyber weaponry is part of this Chinese expansion, and so on. To speak of a galaxy empire is also to emphasize just how rare empires on this scale are. I mean, every empire recorded lays claim to being universal. Technically, it was only after 1945 that two global empires emerged, hostile and opposed to one another, the Soviet Union and the United States. Soviet Union collapses for a very brief period. The American empire rules without a competitor. Ironically, it enabled China to rise. We now have a dynamic in which the United States and China, seen from the perspective of this book, are two entangled empires in competition with one another. And that's an old pattern, by the way, in empires. They often come in pairs. Spain versus England, Portugal versus the Netherlands, British versus American, Russian versus Japanese. We have now a tension between China and the United States. Fifth reason for using this phrase, sorry to go on, this is an empire that is neither a land-based, nor a sea-based, nor an air-based empire. In this respect, bless him, I disagree with Paul Keating, who still wants to say that China is basically a land power and the United States is a sea power. What the book shows, in fact, is that this emergent galaxy empire has actually combined land and sea and air, including space power, into something that is new. If I had time, maybe in questions, I can elaborate on the way that this emergent empire has an interest in land territory, for sure. Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong, maybe next Taiwan. It operates leases, such as in Sihanoukville. But it's also a sea power, and if you look at a company like COSCO, one of the world's largest shipping companies, you see that this large shipping company is also involved in land, the movement of goods and services on land. And of course, this galaxy empire is a space power. I could go on, but this point that I want to make, that this is an empire that is neither a land, nor sea, nor air power. There is then, I come next to the sixth point. I want to ask the basic question which all analysts of empires in the past have raised. How resilient is this empire? What are its strengths? What are its weaknesses? This is, for instance, the great theme of Edward Gibbon's account of the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, a great multi-volume work written in the 18th century. This sixth point, I think, is critically important because it is not enough just to describe the emergence of this empire. It's important to look at the reasons for its rise and to ask the question whether it is, let's say, more like the Qing Empire, which lasts nearly 300 years, or whether it's like Betelgeuse, this red star that is actually exploding and disintegrating as I speak. Is it a short-lived empire? The Nazi Empire lasted 12 years. The Khmer Empire, the largest in Southeast Asia, lasted around 6 centuries. So did the Ottoman Empire. What kind of durability does this empire have? Well, 7th point. One feature which is unusual of this galaxy empire is that it does not make the mistake that modern European empires made, where first out went companies like the Royal African Company, or the Dutch VOC, or the British East India Company, exploiting resources and setting up trade patterns. And then, when trouble began, dispatched troops to guard the investments. What I think is very striking when you start looking at the details is that this galaxy empire does the two simultaneously. That is to say, it's engaged in not only trade, investment, banking, and so on and so forth, it's also engaged in building governing institutions and operating within existing institutions. So, for instance, kangaroo hopping through the points, this empire is very actively involved in the United Nations. 4 of the 15 special agencies by election, by secret ballot, are now led by the Chinese. The Chinese is the second largest investor in peacekeeping, UN peacekeeping forces. When in the WTO Trump tried to kill it, or to kill the disputes panel, China, together with Australia and Canada, stepped in to set up a parallel disputes panel so that the WTO could continue to function. So China is involved in existing institutions. It's also cross-border institutions. It's also building its own. The examples given in the book include the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, a very important alliance of states in which Russian and Chinese are the 2 working languages, in which China does not exercise a veto. And there are also bodies like BRICS of emerging significance. If you look at the South African case against Israel and the claim that Israel is committing genocide, the Chinese were very actively involved in the diplomacy in this case. And then there are, as well, in this growth of governing institutions, lots of cross-border gongos, I call them, governmental NGOs. You'll know about the Confucius Institutes. You may not know about Amity. It's one of the very large gongos that is at work globally. It's based on an acronym, its name, Accountability, Motivation, Integrity, Teamwork, Youthfulness. It's the world's largest producer of Bibles, would you believe? The point is that there's a simultaneous growth of cross-border governing mechanisms that the Chinese are championing at the same time as, of course, all of the economic dynamics. 8th point, there is a question about whether there is a legitimating ideology of this empire. I mean, all previous empires typically had a ruling narrative. So, for example, Portugal and Spain governed in the name, globally, in the name of the church and the monarchy. The British used the language of civilization. I have a juicy quote from Joseph Chamberlain, 1895. "I believe in the British Empire," he boasted. And I believe in the British race. I believe that the British race is the greatest of governing races that the world has ever seen. This is the Ottoman Empire, governed in the name of Islam. One of the controversial points in this book is that there is no such ruling myth. There is no such ruling ideology. That in fact, what we have is a kind of polysemic, a kind of basket of languages which Chinese diplomats and party officials and state-owned enterprise executives and so on use both inside and outside China. Let me give you some examples. The book talks in detail about cases that you may not know of. For example, in Nigeria, Hausa is the dominant language, and China Radio International broadcasts in Hausa. And I'm told reliably that if you listen to those programs of news and commentary and current affairs, you will see a mixture of things. You know, China is the champion of poverty reduction. It's the champion of GDP growth. It's the champion of harmonious society. It follows Confucian principles. It wants the democratization of international relations. I'm just quoting. It defends an ancient Chinese civilization. It's a champion of national pride. It's the friend of rule of law. It wants peace. It's against imperialism. Sometimes there are dollops of Marxism thrown in. There's much talk of socialism, and of course plenty of talk of democracy, and strange dynamics in which, for example, in Cambodia, the Europeans in 2018 pulled out, and the Americans pulled out of support for the Cambodian general election. And guess who steps in to provide the voting booths and the machines and so on? The Chinese. I mean, if you just think about what I've said about these narratives, they don't crystallize. But that's the point. Yu Hua, the great Chinese writer, has said that the function of this kind of discourse that's like a dog's dinner of terms is that it has the effect of bamboozling. Huyo, it has great bamboozling potential, so that Chinese diplomats can be in the world many things to many different people, both at home and abroad. Well, that's the broad idea, that this is an unusual source of strength of this empire, that it can be many things to many different groups and peoples at many points on our planet. It can sail, so to say, with the political wings. Ninth point, almost finished, and I'm not sure about my time. Never allow the goat to look after the garden again. Is that in matters of the resilience of empires, in the literature, in the history of empires, there is, I would say, one very basic weakness and a key cause of the decline and collapse of empires, and it is the problem of abusive predatory power. Empires, of course, are caught in a conundrum. As they develop, they of course develop a kind of bossiness. They do things often in opposition to their policies. But if they push too fast and too hard, then they risk calling their own power into question. And this dynamic of abusive predatory power versus public accountability is very central to this book, and I can't summarize it easily in this short time, but roughly what I want to say is, in as nuanced a way as possible and even-handed, is that when it comes to domestic power, this empire in its heartlands is of course an empire where the party rules. It's a one-party state. But it's a mistake, so the argument is, to describe the heartlands of this empire as a mere autocracy, or as a totalitarian system, or as an authoritarian system. I've written about this in other contexts, and there's more of this in the book. And I do so, I question the use of those terms because I think they're misdescriptions of a much greater complexity of things. For instance, if you look at the literature on Xi Jinping, Jeremy Barmay, one of our scholars, famously called him the chairman of everything. And you get the sense that this is a strong man whose hand covers the heavenly sky. 知受知天 is the Chinese expression. You get the impression that he's the big boss emperor. Actually, the evidence is against that. The evidence is that he's caught up in, entangled in, very complex power dynamics. There are moments when actually he is rebuffed by the multi-layered complexities of the political system in its heartlands. And there are moments, of course, when there are protests against his power, most recently in those demonstrations that led to an end to the COVID lockdown, where you may know that there were demonstrators that went viral on social media denouncing him with chants and phrases like banana peels, 香蕉屁. If you know Chinese, you know that they're the initials of Xi Jinping. And you know, to call out banana peels is, of course, you know, this is dangerous stuff. So it's also the case about the heartlands that I think that talk of it as an authoritarian regime, you know, it's just the fist that rules, seriously underestimates the cleverness of this political system, in which there are all kinds of attempts by the party at all levels to experiment with ways of encouraging support, developing mechanisms for listening, and mechanisms for lodging complaints against the system. Let me just mention a few examples. I want to say that the party understands the proverb, when trees fall, monkeys scatter. That's the title of a previous book. They understand that power is not the same as authority. They understand at most levels that the party, if it loses popular support, then it risks collapse. And so this, at home, there is a kind of phantom democracy that this system peddles. Constant affirmation, reaffirmation that it's the people who rule. It's a fiction, it's got a phantomic quality, it's real and not real. The constant use of legal mediation committees, more than 1 million of these exist to resolve conflicts at the local level. Democracy life meetings that happen in the upper echelons of the party. Emergency response centers, the reliance on public opinion polling. Events like the 315 Gala, which is an annual consumer quality program where certain products are trashed, where the audience size is around 1 billion, where the party is effectively saying to the population, we understand that you mistrust the quality of foods, that you have doubts about the food chains and so on. Well, here in this program, we're showing you that there are certain products that are really dodgy. That's the end, typically, of those projects. I could go on, but that phantom democracy idea is very important, and I see this as a mechanism, a kind of shock-absorbing mechanism by which, in its heartlands, the party rules, and it rules in a kind of skittish way. It's aware that it cannot rule through the fist alone. It cannot rule through brute power. The same problem, I say in the book, applies to areas outside the heartlands. What I think, to put it very simply, is that if it's a 40-year-old fledgling empire, then troubles are going to accumulate in lands far away from the boundaries of China. And there are signs already of this resistance to this emergent empire. It's not clear to me how these will be resolved or to what extent, but let me mention some examples. In Kazakhstan, in 2019, serious protests against the construction of Chinese factories and the maltreatment of Muslim and Turkic peoples in Xinjiang. Zambia has been gripped for several decades by clashes between local mining workers and Chinese employers. Every continent is witnessing suspicion and open public criticism of the Galaxy Empire. There is a very interesting South African, by the Ichkowitz Foundation, a South African survey of young people's attitudes towards China in Africa. And the pattern is roughly 2/3 think that China is much more important than the United States. There's a very high ranking of support for Chinese investment, building football stadiums, et cetera, creating jobs. But there's also around 1/3 of young people, this foundation discovered, around 1/3 of young people are actually suspicious and even are prepared to use the word colonialism to describe Chinese power, arbitrary power, being exercised, as it were, in their backyards. It's not clear, I'm bowdlerizing what the book says, but it's not clear how these faraway troubles will pan out. Probably the time is coming where there will be blowback. That is, from far distant places, blowback into the heartlands of the empire. And already you can see that troubles are coming. The Sudan withdrawal, the withdrawal guarded by the PLA from Libya and also from Yemen, where Chinese investors find themselves in very difficult circumstances, where a regime is collapsing or a civil war erupts, and China has to somehow deal with that problem. Those problems, it seems to me, are likely to multiply, and they have everything to do with this problem of arbitrary power. To finish this ninth point, almost finished, Ian, I would say that if you look carefully at Chinese behavior globally and of this empire's relationship with organizations and in negotiations, you will find exceptions to what I have just said. The one example that the book talks about at some length is the negotiation of the world's first biodiversity agreement in Montreal in late 2022. China was the president of this delayed negotiation, the world's first biodiversity agreement with clauses about redistribution of costs was negotiated successfully in Montreal, and it was done, according to Canadian diplomats, with great professionalism by the Chinese. And the question, therefore, that the book tables is whether this empire has a capacity to be like the Ottomans. That is, does it have the capacity to learn to restrain itself in various places globally, to win hearts and minds, to win cooperation through what is often called administrative absorption? This is a great question, I think, that we need to end almost this talk on. Last point, peace and war. The book uses the phrase militarized peace to describe what the military training schools, academies are doing, what the diplomats are defending, what an emergent arms industry is doing in China. Militarized peace. One thing is clear, the Chinese empire is already embroiled in the foul business of war. I've mentioned Sudan and Libya and Yemen. There is an emergent arms industry. It's about half the size of that of the United States per capita. There is a training of diplomats and PLA officers, of course, in the arts of winning wars without firing a shot. There are a lot of distinctive qualities of, I think, thinking about armaments and about war, and the importance of patience. Fools rush into war is a principle of so much of the training. But this empire is also building up the largest army in the world, but it has an interest, a deep material interest in peace, and hence the militarized peace component. When it comes to conflicts, the book describes quite contradictory behavior of the Chinese. It's interested in Afghanistan and oil and mineral exploit in a country that is still suffering tremendous violence, and so on and so forth. It's no doubt, the book says, there's no doubt that it's the United States that China should worry about. And to finish, I would like just to mention Elbridge Colby. You may not know of him, but he was the principal author of the 2018 under Trump review of military policy. And what Coleridge says in a subsequent book is that China is enemy number one. We should be preparing for military confrontation in the region. You've heard all of this. And the question is how the Chinese will handle this. The book has quite a lot to say about that. And what will be the future? Well, it may not surprise you that the book ends by talking about two science fiction novels. One by Liu Cixin, the great sci-fi writer. It's his first book called 2185. And that is a picture of hot war, a hot nuclear war. This is one option that the book sees as possible. The other is a book by Hao Jingfang, a woman called Vagabonds, also a very fine science fiction writer, where a picture of cold peace is sketched. You know, that there will continue to be indefinitely rumblings and skirmishes and near misses and so on. That's a second scenario. So if you ask me, which is it, Professor Keane, I have to finish with another proverb, which runs something like, when humans on Earth speculate about the future, the gods laugh. I hope that the gods are not already crying. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. We now have a goodly time for questions. I see a few hands rising. Let's start with, please wait for the intern with the microphone to reach you.
Chris Skinner. I look forward to reading your book. It sounds fascinating. One quick observation and then a question. I would characterize the last three or so points that you made as China is a responsive country or power. It listens carefully to the results of the experiments that it takes and learns the lessons and improves. And I think that's perfectly logical and to be expected. And that will apply to military matters just as much as economic and other matters. My question, though, is where does Russia fit into the Chinese galaxy empire, observing the recent agreement that has been struck that knows no limits?
Yeah, it's a very important question. Two aspects. The responsive power, I think you kind of got it, and got it well. I would add to that point that one of the aims of this book is to point things out to a Chinese-speaking audience, and particularly to officials who have no experience in empire building. And what the book tries to probe, to describe and probe, and to question and puzzle over, is just how incredibly complex building an empire is. And stillborn empires, you know, there are many records of stillborn empires. And excessive use of power, predatory abuse of power, I say in the book, is the way to quickly end it. The Nazis, you know, managed to last in that phase of empire building a mere 12 years. On Russia, a lot of the relations with Russia in the last several years are secret. There's a lot of guessing of the China watchers and the Russia watchers. The Chinese view of the Ukraine-Russia war is almost certainly there are payments being made, and there's certainly technological transfers going on, at the same time as the diplomats say it's not our war. And a sign of the rising confidence of this empire is that Xi Jinping tells Joe Biden, you know, you put the bell around the tiger's neck, so you take it off. This is the kind of change of language in which tacitly it's a sort of pro-Putin view. You know, you encircled Russia. You were for NATO expansion eastwards, and of course, you know, it triggered a whole series of consequences, and it produced a war. I would say one other thing about the Russia link, and that is that it should be obvious, is that this Ukraine-Russia war is a warning to the Chinese of not getting involved in such a war. Certainly not vis-a-vis Taiwan. And that raises the question of Taiwan. I'm sure that there are hundreds of questions coming about Taiwan.
Alison.
John, thank you for this, and I too look forward to reading your book.
I too look forward to reading your book. It sounds wonderful. One thing you teased us with at the beginning, and perhaps you'd like to expand on a little before we get on to Taiwan. Antarctica.
Yeah. The 5th polar station has just opened. This empire is operating on all continents. These are stations that are nominally for research. They clearly have a space component. Whether they have a military component is not altogether clear, but most probably. And China, of course, was an early signatory. In fact, I think it helped negotiate the Madrid Protocol, which, of course, expires. It's coming up. But it seems to me, although there is a lot of saber rattling by critics of China, it seems to me that the Chinese largely play by the rules in that Madrid Protocol process. Yep. And in this respect, contribute to a post-sovereign system of government which is much more successful than the European Union. I mean, in Europe you hear that the EU is the world's first attempt to build cross-border, post-sovereign, post-territorial state governing arrangements. Actually, that's not true, because the Antarctic Treaty is the world's first. It was born of the fear of nuclear war, and the Chinese are, it seems to me, contributing to that, to the continuation of that process.
Well, go.
Thanks, John, very much for that. When I think of empire, I immediately think of the great historical empires that you've mentioned.
Mm.
But I'm also impressed by the fact that the metropolitan power, whether it was Britain or France or Portugal or Spain, always had interests involved. Now, what I find absent from your talk is some discussion about what interests China has in empire. I think it's a marvellous description about the multifarious ways in which the advance of empire might proceed and the differences. And I think China is probably very clever in doing this. But it still doesn't alter the fact that they must have an interest in empire.
Of course.
And could you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, tremendously. I mean, it's a very basic and really important question. Tremendous amounts of capital can be earned through the banking system, through dominating global markets in electric vehicles, BYD, for instance. Solar panels. I mean, it's a very long list of economic interests that China is linked to in this empire. It's driven heavily by a political economy interests, but it also it has a material interest in cross-border governing arrangements, I tried to explain, that can serve to stabilize areas and produce policies that are in the interests of Chinese capital, state-owned enterprises, and so on. It has, of course, it seems to me, one of its weaknesses. It has a material interest in spreading the norms of the empire. And what I've tried to say is, tonight in a very Bowdlerized way, is that that's a very tricky dynamic in which, yes, the Chinese have an interest in persuading others that this empire is benign, that China is needed, for win-win situations. The jargon is used very widely. Every speech of Xi, when he's at Davos or in other circumstances, says these kinds of things, trying to persuade organizations and whole states and peoples that this is an empire that, the comparison is not drawn, that rather is the Ottoman rather than the Nazi empire. And this, of course, finally, I think, raises a very tricky question, which I think the book mulls over. I think it's very exercised by the question of whether, on balance, all things considered, this rise of China, this galaxy empire, has beneficial effects, or will have beneficial effects, on global order, on improvement of environment, of the maintenance of peace, of keeping cross-border trade going, etc., or not. And I think here, we are in a way all children of empire, most of us are, and we have mixed feelings about empire. What this book tables that question, and it invites readers to kind of get confused and to think through for themselves what is going on in this galaxy empire, in this global galaxy empire. And in a way, please don't misread this or mishear this. In a way, the book wants to say that there are moments, there are dynamics which are undoubtedly positive. In the same way, say that the Ottomans ruled Salonika, the second largest city today in Greece, for some 600 years. where the population was almost 50% Jewish, a big Muslim population and a big Orthodox group, without civil war. And it did so by allowing a great deal of autonomy at a distance. Empires are capable of that. Parliamentary democracy wouldn't have happened here without the British colonization, which was also an extermination process. Just say this last thought. In the 19th century, there was an Oxford professor named Merivale who gave a series of lectures on empire. And one of the points that runs through those lectures is that the British Empire, he said, is actually a very mixed dynamic. You know, it established a military colony on this continent, and it nearly exterminated, he said already, indigenous peoples. And at the same time, it allows free and fair elections in Canada and allows for the enfranchisement of Catholics and women. It's like, what kind of empire is this? You know, that has these multiple phases. Well, the book On Balance says at this point, 40 years into this building of a fledgling empire, that the Galaxy Empire has these qualities for the moment. And that is a political point in the sense that it warns against simple-minded black and white thinking, big China, bad China. It's absurd to think like that because it ultimately will mean war, and it foregoes all kinds of business, diplomatic, cultural opportunities that can be extracted from this empire because the empire is willing to grant a certain release of its own power. This is certainly true for the universities. I mean, it's a very difficult moment in Australian universities and European universities with Chinese universities. But, you know, cooperation is a positive thing, or would be a positive thing, and it's certainly possible. So this is a very long-winded answer to what interest the Chinese have. Huge economic interests, huge geopolitical interests, and once you start building an empire, it's very difficult to retreat. This is one theme that runs through the book. This is a difficult ship to abandon.
3 minutes, 3 questions. We'll go.
Maybe we take them all. And
All right. That never works, but why not? Richard first.
John, fascinating stuff. Last Sunday, walking down Bond Street in Mayfair, is a huge glittering MG showground, an iconic British manufacturer, the MGTC. Every boy dreams about having one. It's now entirely owned by China. I went in there and talked to the salesman. Britain has nothing to do with it. This is an example, wouldn't you say, of the extent of the empire in manufacturing. My question is, though, what, with your experience and your information and the knowledge you've developed and poured into this book, give us an idea of what could happen with the United States and China. It seems to me there are two sides. One is the business side, the practical American wish to continue to have profitable relations with China. On the other hand, you've got a military-industrial complex that seems to want to have a war in which Australia would ineluctably be drawn.
yeah.
Give us your thoughts about that, if you would.
Yeah, you draw me out, Richard, because the book it doesn't dodge these questions, but the American empire, let's call it so, forgive me, is always in, so to say, the background. I think that in this book, if we think about economic, diplomatic, governing power, and cultural power, let's simplify things. So if we think in those terms, what we're witnessing is the tremendous gains economically of the Chinese. 4 biggest banks, de-dollarization, the breaking of the US dollar Saudi oil link. It passed by journalists with very little treatment. It's of fundamental importance because it's central to the US dollar globally and the ability of Washington to run huge deficits of trillions of dollars. The Chinese negotiated the purchasing of oil in yuan, in renminbi. So economically, there is a lot of writing on the wall for the United States. And basically what this book gives you the impression of is that the Chinese are creating a kind of alternative space of economic power, always state-backed, an alternative space that actually is, its purpose is to outflank the United States, to push it aside, to marginalize it. That's going on, and I think talk of the collapse of China because of youth unemployment or a housing bubble, I think is overdone. On the geopolitical front, in matters of diplomacy and governing arrangements, it's also clear, there's tremendous ignorance in Washington, but there's also clear that China is, again, decoupling, de-risking, outflanking the United States. There is one weapon that the United States has that is, of course, much more powerful, it seems, and that's military spending. As much in 2024 as the next 7 or 8 countries combined. Chinese expenditure is about half that per GDP, etc. But this Chinese PLA army is substantial, 2 million troops, etc., etc. So culturally, this is another question. So I'm rambling here, but what I want to say is that if you look at economic factors and if you look at governing diplomacy factors, then there really is trouble here and on the horizon for the United States, which is now embroiled in 2 wars. It took the decision just over 5 years ago to concentrate resources on fighting only one, and that would be in our region. So there's one other thing I'd like to say about the United States. It was mentioned to the interns. I mean, you can continue to, after reading this book, you can continue to think that the United States is clearly the dominant empire. This book calls that into question. We've got 2 entangled empires that are caught up in serious tensions. Empires, to recall, often come in pairs. And one loses and the other gains. The book also poses the question of whether it's possible to interpret the United States as an empire in decline, which is doing what declining empires typically do, which is to fight wars and refuse to go. Haven't won a war since 1945. 800 military bases in over 75 countries, but they don't win wars. And you could say, well, this is a sign of U.S. strength globally. It is the foundation of their power. But you could also interpret it, as this book suggests, as symptomatic of decline. Just as the British tried to hold on to an empire after 45 with tremendous violence in Kenya. Caroline Elkin's work writes about that. 1 million people put into concentration camps in the Mau Mau uprising. Tremendous violence in Malaysia, etc., etc. In the end, it led to Brexit, one could say. And the question is whether, in this book, is tabled the question of whether this is what is also going on with the United States. And the auxiliary questions whether Chinese officials, PLA people, diplomats and so on, are aware of this. My own intuition is that they are, and they are prepared to play a waiting game. Don't expect an invasion of Taiwan tomorrow. One of the good things about the Ukraine war is that it's a reminder that not to get involved in wars like that. And the Chinese can wait. They can wait. And they can watch a polity tear itself to pieces. And they can watch them losing war after war. Well, this is a theme that runs through the book. It's not a defense of China, per se. It's not a blind, starry-eyed view of China. It's an attempt to describe the emergence of an empire that is a really serious alternative, much more serious than that of the Soviet Union, much more durable at home and abroad. Very different. It's a galaxy empire, also, I suggest.
Well, let's have those last two questions together. Where's the microphone?
Thank you, Professor Keane. My name is Phoebe Alexander. I just want to say thank you for the talk, and I would like to know that you mentioned democracy, and you also mentioned that Xi Jinping is 只手遮天, which means that he could use one hand and cover the world, and he could do whatever he wants. And then you also mentioned democracy in China, so I just don't know how that mixed. So we know that China has been growing very slowly, but gradually, but in the last few years it's been leaps and bounds. Do you really think that the world that has appeased China for so long, it actually created a monster that it doesn't know what to do with it and cannot be content anymore?
And the gentleman behind you.
Okay. Thank you.
Chris Hamer. So, John, you said you were expecting a question on Taiwan.
I'd expect it from you, Chris.
So Xi Jinping has publicly announced that China will retake the Taiwanese democracy by force if necessary. He said by 2048.
Or by building a bridge. The construction's begun. 2035.
Okay. Anyway, experts, he's been preparing for it as fast as he can go. And experts say he'll be ready by 2027. And the result may be that we find ourselves in World War III. So I'm just interested in what your view is on that.
Yeah. I go backwards, Chris. I refer to the deities and their laughter, or maybe their crying. I don't know. I mean, what we do know is that if you look at the origins of World War I, as you know well, better than I do, it's preparation for war and its unintended, surprising dynamics and unintended consequences that turned out to be the prime cause of that war. And that dynamic is certainly in train here. And the book talks about it in the end section on this Chinese image of, or this Chinese sort of set of principles that I call militarized peace. I think, so I don't know. I do know that Henry Kissinger's view has been outflanked, and Kissinger is on this question a conservative. So is actually the Australian official government policy, which is that we agreed to recognize the People's Republic. We agreed to remove Taiwan from the Security Council. We are still committed to the non-declaration of independence, of sovereign independence of Taiwan. And so one option is that this status quo is maintained. And that would avoid a serious regional conflict and probably a global war. The alternative is, of course, catastrophe, I would have thought. But my expectation is that we come to the monster question, Phoebe's monster question. I mean, I think the book tables so much evidence against that view. Yes, there are things monstrous that the governing party has done, for example, in Xinjiang. The book is very open about the colonization of Tibet and Xinjiang. That's what empires do, by the way, on their rise. That's what the Americans did as they moved westwards when they invaded the Philippines, or when they nearly exterminated indigenous peoples. That's what empires do, and it's very honest about that. My own, is it a hope or is it an intuition, is that this takeover of the province of Taiwan will happen more slowly than we expect, unless there's a provocation by the United States. That's basically my view. And when you read, I mentioned Elbridge Colby, if you read that document, that 2018 defense report, it's pretty alarming. It's pretty alarming. And the naivete of what kind of war this would be is stunning. Yeah, the monster, I think the book is against this view. And it's against this view for empirical reasons. I mean, just descriptive reasons. What it tries to do is to present to you a kind of tapestry of all the contradictory things that are going on. And the policy implication of that is that governments of Australia, of Europe and so on, need to pay attention to those complexities. And they are not all monstrous. And monster, the portrayal of China as a monster is, it seems to me, it's a recipe for war, basically. And, we're witnessing two at the moment, two very major wars, and they're nasty, they're destructive, and they're ecocidal wars, that's for sure. Taiwan would be no different. So I expect that it will be a slow motion pressuring, constant pressuring. The PLA will encircle the archipelago again and again, with its jets, with its navy, and the bridge will be slowly built, and there will be an attempt to persuade the majority of Taiwanese that this is not going to be a Hong Kong takeover. I think it's a great, last point, I think it's a great question that I return to, as to whether this empire is capable of allowing, of tolerating difference on its margins, or even close to its heartlands. I think we can't answer that question yet, but the book makes an appeal for opening our minds to see that previous empires did it. The Ottoman Empire certainly did it. And it's not a defense of the Ottoman Empire, but the complexity of the Ottoman Empire, its ability to govern peoples and persuade them that their rule was a clear positive alternative to other possibilities, is very striking. And that's the question, I think, that confronts this empire. It's one of the key reasons why taking the word empire and applying it to China, I think it's one of the key advantages. It forces us to think in more complex ways about what kind of empire it is. And to repeat, it seems to me that the officials, state-owned enterprise, executives, etc., have no experience in building an empire. That's very important. I have been asking in the past 2 years or so whether this book will appear in Chinese. It won't. It won't. But I'm told, maybe reliably, that it will be translated and it will be circulated in the upper echelons of the PLA military academies, and possibly even into the Politburo. Tremendous interest in this topic. It's a bad word, equal, but it's a word needed to make sense of this massive development that I think we're going to live with. And I say that, last sentence, I think that whatever you think of what I said tonight in a very Bowdlerized way, I hope that it gets you thinking because becoming familiar with the complexities of this empire is mandatory, because it's going to be around for as long as we are.
Thank you very much, John. It's been a great pleasure to welcome you here tonight, and your wife, Wei. Very good to have you here as well. Our next live event here at Glover Cottages will be next week, an address by Tom Switzer, the head of the Centre for Independent Studies here in Sydney. His address is entitled Ukraine, NATO and a New Cold War. The following week, in early June, we'll be putting out the next edition of Columns from Glover Cottages. And then on the 11th of June, we return to Russia with an address by Peter Tesch, former ambassador to Russia, earlier ambassador to Germany, and later Deputy Secretary of the Department of Defense. His title is called Putin, Russia into Perspective. Get it? And we gather that he's going to be putting a somewhat different perspective than we've perhaps been hearing here in recent months. But to round off this evening, I invite one of our interns, Jerry Lynn, to move a vote of thanks.
Tonight we've had the privilege to hear from the esteemed Professor John Keane. He was nominated for the 2021 Bowsen Prize and the Holberg Prize in recognition of his outstanding global contributions to the human sciences that span from his founding of the world's first democracy research institute, the London-based Centre for the Study of Democracy, to authoring many distinguished books, Tom Paine, A Political Life, Violence and Democracy, and I'm sure China's Galaxy Empire will be one too. The audience tonight, we've had some thought-provoking questions of China's interests from the audience, and John has elegantly answered those. John made the particularly telling point that China, a galaxy empire, is operating on all continents and space even, with its power entering the affairs of other states and to the extent reshaping everyday habits of their subjects, like the China-funded radio in Nigeria, as he pointed out. He has given me additional insight into China's unique position on the global stage and has left me to wonder what the fate of the Galaxy Empire is in the near future. I moved that we express our thanks to John for his address this evening with a round of applause.